Oh,
I don't
yeah,
know.
58.1. That's good.
That's not good because it's not 0.1, but it's 58 and it's 1.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, looks like we're joining
Streaming? Are
YouTube.
we streaming?
Are we
All
live here?
right.
I'd like
All
to get a
right.
background like.
Welcome everybody to the VdGSA YouTube channel. If you found us, you're in the right place. We just started NonClave, our first online conclave. We've got president of the VdGSA, Lisa Terry. We've got Roz Morley, music director, conclave music director. We've got John Moran, vice president. We're looking forward very much to seeing Loren Ludwig and his wonderful presentation. For all you non-clave attendees, a couple announcements. I'm just going to pretend we're at conclave and we're having an event because that's what's happening here, even though it's on YouTube. So I just wanted to say I hope you enjoyed your first day of non-clave. I've heard some good reports about our new experience of classes online with lots of people and wonderful teachers. A couple announcements. For registered non-clave attendees, after Loren's lecture, starting at 9:30, there's the Young Players meeting for which you non-clave attendees have received a Zoom link in your lengthy email last night. So you have to find your email because we're kind of busy right now. And then the other thing is for all members, we have our vendors emporium online. You can find lots of stuff about them on the VdGSA Facebook page, as well as the members area coming soon, and all kinds of neat things to find out about our vendors, gambas, music, all kinds of stuff that you want to know about. And we also have an online auction going on right now, which will close tomorrow evening. And we'll have our second YouTube live event tomorrow night when that silent auction online, it's so silent, it's online, that will be closing tomorrow evening with a fun auction antics, we called it, with Sarah Mead and Robert Bolliard. So you found the channel, and we'll be sending out a link. And without further ado, here's Roz Morley, Conclave Music Director.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Risa. Welcome to both non-clave registrants and members of the Society who are evening visitors and the general public to our first lecture of Non-Clave Week. Tonight, Loren Ludwig is going to push us from the 21st century back to the 17th and then pull us forward again with his lecture that's called #Gambo, the Viol as Social Media in England and America. And afterwards, Loren will answer questions that you put in the chat. But when you use the chat, please put your name and where you're from when you ask your question. That is always so interesting. We love to know where people are coming from. So, a little bit about Loren. Loren is a scholar performer who's based in Baltimore, Maryland. And as a musicologist, he explores the social dimensions of musical polyphony. You know, how musical counterpoint fosters social relationships among those who sing or play, and what we can learn about those relationships by studying past musical cultures. Loren got his PhD in musicology from the University of Virginia, and his work has been supported by the Fulbright Program, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the American Musicological Society, and the Viola da Gamba Society of America. As a performer, Loren seeks to balance passion and precision in his music making. He's been praised for his impeccable intonation and cleanness of tone by the Washington Post, and he aspires to the generosity that he hears in the most inspiring music around him. He's a co-founder of the viol consort Lestrange Viols and Science Ficta, and a member of Acronym, which just released a new CD of modern premieres of 17th century music for voices and instruments called Cantica Obsoleta. And you can find all sorts of cool stuff on his website. which is lorenludwig.com, LorenLudwig.com. So please welcome Loren into your music rooms or your living rooms and learn about the hashtag Gambo.
So a few small things have changed since last fall, when I was generously invited to give this talk and came up with a title and topic. Alongside exploring some of the social aspects of viol playing in England, I had hoped to share some of my recent research on a manuscript of viola da gamba music from colonial Virginia that I discovered in an archive in Richmond. But that was before the age of Zoom, when we actually traveled to specific locations and gave talks to particular groups of people who had also traveled to that specific location. Contrast that with this spring, when various of my presentations on the James River Music Book and other discoveries related to the viol in colonial Virginia and Maryland were delivered, recorded, and posted online. My research and modern premiere recording of the solo suites in the James River Music Book was generously supported by the VdGSA, and I was eager to share it live at Conclave. But now everything is online and my research is easily available to those who are curious. So today's talk will conveniently omit the final 2 words of the title, the "and America" part. Instead, this moment invites a different sort of reflection on what it means to be together, even virtually, as musicians and consort players. Back in the fall, I imagined that hashtag Gambo, the viol as social media, would make a whimsical title for an exploration of some of my research on the social nature of viol playing. I pictured giving a talk about social and polyphonic intimacy, and then walking off stage to go actually enjoy some promiscuous consort playing of the sort that only occurs at Conclave. Instead, I find myself mourning the absence of exactly the sociality I had planned to celebrate, and wondering how and whether we as a community might begin to find ways to recapture a bit of the joyful musical intimacy that we long for, to find ways to celebrate the musical family of the Viola da Gamba Society of America. So I don't want to lean too heavily or pedantically on the conceit of my title, The Viol is Social Media. But in our current moment, I wonder whether such a formulation might have something to offer. How might thinking about the viol playing as a social medium help us navigate, as musicians, our current historical moment? I'll start with a couple modern definitions, and then share some historical accounts from the archive that illuminate how viol playing can foster community and connection, even during difficult times. Social media. Now, media that enable users to create and share content or to participate in social networking. Social network. Now, a network of social interactions and personal relationships. Thomas Mace's oft-quoted encomium to consort playing from the 1760s or 70s, maybe, I guess, 1670s, captures, I think, a vision of polyphony that fosters, quote, social interactions and interpersonal relationships. Mace writes, "We had for our grave music fantasias of 3, 4, 5, and 6 parts to the organ, interposed now and then with some pavans, almains, solemn and sweet delightful airs, all which were, as it were, so many pathetical stories, rhetorical and sublime discourses, subtle and acute argumentations, so suitable and agreeing to the inward secret and intellectual faculties of the soul and mind, that to set them forth according to their true praise, there are no words sufficient in language." While small ensembles of viols had been known in England since the 1530s and the reign of Henry VIII, it was the use of consort songs for one singer and 4 or 5 viols later in the 16th century that brought the viol consort to the broader attention of the English aristocracy. Sometime around the middle of the century, choir schools had started training choristers in the use of viols as part of their musical education. Viols were great for teaching music notation and the ensemble skills necessary to perform complex polyphony. These choir schools often financed themselves by performing plays for the nobility, featuring chorister, actors, and viol players, who would perform consort songs on stage as part of the drama. Such performances featuring viols on stage would have been many people's first glimpse of a viol or a viol consort. Writing in his diary on a tour of England in 1602, Duke Philip Julius of Stettin, Pomerania, described children's theater under Elizabeth I. The Duke writes, "The origin of this children's comedium is this. The Queen keeps a number of young boys who have to apply themselves zealously to the art of singing and to learn all the various musical instruments, and to pursue their studies at the same time. These boys have special preceptors in all the different arts, especially very good musicos, and in order that they may acquire courteous manners, they are required to act a play once a week, for which purpose the Queen has erected for them a special theatrum with an abundance of costly garments. There are always a good many people present, many respectable women as well, because useful argumenta and many good doctrines, as we were told, are brought forward there." I'm struck by the resonance between Duke Julius's description of the plays with their useful argumenta and many good doctrines, and the Mace quote with which I began, describing consort music some 70 years later as, quote, "so many pathetical stories, rhetorical and sublime discourses, subtle and acute argumentations." Many of our favorite composers of consort music, including Byrd, Coprario, East, Ferrabosco, Gibbons, Morley, Tye, Ward, and others, started their careers as choristers singing and playing viols. As they grew up and established the patronage of aristocratic music lovers, they brought their experience and love of consort playing into the aristocratic households that would become Jacobean and Caroline consort music's native habitat. Thus, the viol consort moved from the relatively public 16th century stage, where consort songs were performed by choristers as part of the drama, to the private music room of the aristocracy, where consorts were enjoyed by the amateur players and perhaps a few friends or musical servants. The plays in which choristers performed consort songs are also the origin of the deep connections between English melancholy and the viol consort. The majority of surviving consort songs are actually settings of melancholic poetry, many drawn from the Paradise of Dainty Devices of 1576, a compendium of melancholic and moralizing poetry that had a tremendous influence in English literary and musical culture. It's instructive to compare comments from the period on the so-called peculiar pleasure of expressing sadness with comments on the capacity of music to make sadness feel and sound good. Here's George Puttenham, writing in his Art of English Poesy of 1589. "Lamenting," Puttenham writes, "is altogether contrary to rejoicing. Every man saith so. And yet it is a piece of joy to be able to lament with ease, and freely to pour forth a man's inward sorrows and the griefs wherewith his mind is surcharged." Compare this to Dowland's preface to the Lacrimae or Seven Tears of 1604, the touchstone of melancholic consort music. Wonderful collection of music that I'm sure we've all dug into. Dowland writes, "And though the title doth promise tears, unfit guests in these joyful times, yet no doubt pleasant are the tears which music weeps." If you think about it, English melancholy is strangely self-contradictory. On the one hand, it professes to be about solitude. The archetype of Renaissance melancholy in poetry and art is the lonely young man, weeping quietly about lost love or moral failure, even as he sneaks a look in the mirror in his darkened room to appreciate the pale beauty of his own grief. On the other hand, melancholy only makes sense, really, if it has an audience, or better yet, if there are people to share it with. This social melancholy, amplified by playing consort music with a group of friends, leverages the social energy of a circle of musicians facing inward to amplify the pleasure of musical sadness. This sweet, pleasurable sadness, captured in the act of playing, for example, Dowland's Lacrimae Pavans, is in the DNA of consort music. Even fantasias and pavans that don't explicitly quote the lacrimae theme often feature melancholic moments, slow, aching passages rich in painfully pleasurable suspensions that offer shared moments of pathos that, like melancholy itself, seem to send the gaze both inwards and outwards at the same time. So the consort song was the first meeting place of English melancholy and consort playing. But in different hands, the consort song would become something else entirely, as Catholic composers would use the form to set texts that expressed, in sometimes coded language, the pain and anger of being persecuted by Elizabethan Protestant authorities. For many aristocratic Catholic families, consort playing evidently became an activity through which players shared a ritual musical intimacy that was deeply connected to their religious identity and practice. Since celebrating Mass, or even being caught with Catholic religious books or materials, could be punishable by death, playing motets or masses on viols seems to have become a way for Catholics to share a ritual musical intimacy for which they could escape notice or punishment. After all, without incriminating Latin texts, polyphony is just polyphony, right? This is a familiar story, and it's no coincidence that many surviving manuscripts of consort music were assembled and treasured by recusant Catholic families. As modern consort players, we really owe a tremendous debt to English Crypto-Catholicism for the cultivation and survival of Elizabethan consort music. It's many of the surviving sources of Elizabethan music were actually gathered together by Catholic families that seem to have used it as part of the way that they sort of circled their wagons socially during the oppression of the Elizabethan reformers. I'll mention two examples that help tell this story. William Byrd, the most famous crypto-Catholic composer, is at the center of the story. His publication of devotional consort songs, Psalms, Sonnets, and Songs of Sadness and Piety of 1588, include 10 psalm settings and 7 songs of sadness and piety, consort songs that were newly designed for private use in homes, as opposed to public performance on stage as part of chorister theater. Byrd's collection of music for voices and viols included Henry Walpole's poem, Why Do I Use?, a tribute to the martyred Jesuit priest Edmund Campion. Walpole, also a Jesuit priest, secretly on assignment in England, would be executed for his beliefs in 1595. Walpole had witnessed the very public and brutal execution of Edmund Campion 15 years before his own martyrdom, and anonymously published a collection of poems in London about the plight of Catholics in England. The printer of Walpole's collection lost his ears to Elizabethan censors. But Byrd set Walpole's poem, Why Do I Use?, as a consort song in Psalms, Sonnets, and Songs, a poem that would have been instantly recognizable to English Catholics, even in the slightly altered form Byrd set. And Byrd used an adapted version of the poem because he had seen what had happened to printers and publishers that printed this material, and I think he wanted to shield them a bit. But to English Catholics, it was clear what the poem was and what it was about, and it had all of those resonances that Byrd had hoped to put in it. Today, I imagine groups of these amateur Catholic musicians through the lens of COVID-19 pods. Small select groups of people who can gather because they have been designated as safe. Catholics in Elizabethan England craved the company of their friends and community, yet gathering together was dangerous and uncertain. Does that sound familiar? Playing music together was a somewhat safer way to share some of the experience of Catholic identity, even if diffused by coded poetry and instruments in place of a choir singing Catholic liturgy. Numerous surviving manuscript collections may be the traces of these Elizabethan Catholic pods. The Baldwin Commonplace Book, various of the Paston manuscripts, and numerous other manuscript collections of polyphony feature untexted versions of Catholic masses and motets cheek to jowl with instrumental consort music. Christchurch 979 through 83, for example, a set of part books, contains textless consort music bound together with a print of Byrd's Canciones Sacrae, his collection of explicitly Catholic motets, boldly published in 1589. Clearly, The members of whichever pod of Catholic viol players played from this collection must have deemed each other safe, must have thought through the logistical details of how they would travel and gather and create a small archipelago of safety and intimacy in a dangerous and uncertain world. The medium of this social intimacy is polyphony played on viols, and the feeling of confederacy, of gathering together in a small, safe group to create something beautiful, remains in the DNA of consort playing, long after the end of the specific religious persecution that engendered it. So the early history of consort playing in England featured the viol as a social medium, both in its capacity to stage shared melancholy and its ability to offer a bit of disguised ritual intimacy for Catholic musicians cast aside and persecuted by Elizabethan Protestantism. In both instances, the consort foregrounded the experience of being together, of sharing feelings and ideas, and the warmth of harmony. Let's now jump half a century forward to see how these early trends developed. Another snapshot of the viol and consort music as a social medium is provided by the Lestrange family of Hunstanton, Norfolk, a hamlet in the northeast of England. The patriarch of the family, Hammond Lestrange, was an avid patron of the arts and music, and those activities, along with popular pastimes like playing cards, hunting, hawking, and drinking, seem to have occupied quite a bit of the noble family's time. Hammond's sons, Nicholas, Hammond, and Roger, and his wife, Dame Alice, frequently gathered to play consorts with various guests and musical servants, including Thomas Brewer and John Jenkins, who spent much of his life in the Lestrange orbit. 3 surviving documents from roughly the middle of the 17th century capture a bit of the spirit of the social world that was consort music's native habitat. Dame Alice kept a meticulous account book, which documents all sorts of household expenditures and activities, and features fascinating references to the acquisition and maintenance of viols, strings, and payments to musical servants who joined the family in their leisure activities. Nicholas Lestrange, who would die in 1655 at about 50 years old, kept a jest book in which he collected over 600 anecdotes and jokes told at family gatherings. Many of these describe social music making, as well as all sorts of other activities, and the Lestrange jest book opens a delightful and often scandalous window into the world of the aristocratic country house, the setting you should imagine for Jacobean and Caroline consort music. John Jenkins, Thomas Brewer, Simon Ives, Theodore Steffkins, and other musicians appear in or are listed as having told the various jests, and I'll read a few in a minute. Finally, the Lestrange part books are one of the key sources of the lion's share of some of our favorite 5- and 6-part consort music, including dozens and dozens of the best pieces by Coprario, Cranford, Deering, Ferrabosco II, Lupo, Ward, White, and others. But what's really special about the Lestrange part books is that each part of each piece was evidently checked against other manuscripts that contained that particular piece. So beneath each piece in the Lestrange part books is a list of names, the names of people in the Lestrange orbit who possessed manuscripts of exactly that same music. One can imagine that Nicholas would have brought his part books with him when he visited friends, or would have asked his friends to bring their part books to Hunstanton when they visited to play consorts. Then, Nicholas and one or more friends would pore over their collections, checking each part note by note to make sure that all the different copies agreed. When divergences were found, they were noted in Nicholas's part books, often with a bit of commentary that captures the good-natured arguments that divergent manuscripts must have fomented. Whose copy is right? Let's argue about it. Seems to be what you see in the notations there. I can't help but be struck by the similarity here to a Twitter feed or Facebook wall, where individuals comment one after another, leaving evidence of a conversation that traces the particular social network of that group of commenters. The list of names that appear on each page of the Lestrange part books, as well as the tangle of comments that reveal arguments among Nicholas and his friends about the authenticity of individual musical notes, offers a unique snapshot of the Lestrange social network, a network based in the performing and collecting of consort music. Numerous jests in the Lestrange jest book can be read alongside the manuscript of consort music to reveal a bit of the social scene in Hunstanton. I'll read you a few of my favorites. This one was told by John Jenkins, apparently. One Mr. Saunders, who loved music so well as he could not endure to have it interrupted with the least unseasonable noise, being at a meeting of fancy music, only for the viols and organ, where many ladies and gentlewomen resorted. Some wanton tongues could not refrain their chat, and loud whispers, sometime above the instruments. Saunders, impatient of such harsh discords as they often interposed, the lesson being ended, riseth with his viol from his seat, and soberly addressing himself towards them, Ladies, says he, this music is not vocal, for on my knowledge these things were never made for words. And after that they had not one word to say. Another one. Edmund Gurney used to say that a mathematician is like one that goes to market to buy an axe to break an egg. This one is told anonymously. A gentleman being proffered his part upon the viol of an air which had many semiquaver and many demi-semiquaver rests. I'm going to interrupt here and say, in the manuscript itself, it doesn't say demi-semiquaver or semiquaver. It actually has the rests drawn out. And if you imagine what 17th century handwritten 16th and 32nd note rests look like, you can picture them a little bit like snake tongues, as you'll see. A gentleman being proffered his part upon the viol of an air which had many semiquaver and some demi-semiquaver rests, and full of a stirring division, excused himself thus. Viper tongues are dangerous. I dare not come near them. Besides, I see the air grows so black, as I know there is a storm and tempest coming, and no shelter or refuge left for me, but your indulgence and dispensation from so perilous a task. Remember that line next time somebody puts the Gibbons go from my window on your stand or something like that. Here's another. Clim Ho being at a supper feast. This one isn't about music, by the way. Clim Ho being at a supper feast where his mistress was at the table, what with the spirit of claret and her presence, he swelled so fast and with so much provocation to make water, as he knew not what shift in the world to make, for he was wedged in on the bench side with much company on each hand. At last he resolved, having a winter boot on with a huge large top, to force his instrument downward and discharge all into that. Very silent and intent he was about it, but to avoid suspicion still played with his eyes above board. Yet his cousin, Sergeant Atho's wife, sitting at his elbow, a woman quick-sighted in any knavery and of infinite boldness, observed him, and in the midst of his career, catching him suddenly by the arm, snatched it to her with these words, What art melancholy, cuz? With that, his water bottle spring up and all besprinkled the table in the opposite company, to the excessive laughter of all and unexpressible comfort of his mistress. And then they went and played consort music. Here's one more, also told by Jenkins. One Mr. Holmes of the chapel, who sang very bravely, but had one false eye of glass, at a meeting for voices, he, standing far off from the table, one, noticing his infirmity, moved the music desk closer to him. I pray, hold your hand, sir, says Mr. Holmes. That's not necessary. I see well, and have the advantage of all the company, for if need be, withal pulling out his eye and holding it too, I can bring my eye as near as I will to the book. Finally, I want to consider one additional source that illuminates a community of viol players. You may recognize some of the names. In this case, though, we see how important community was to an individual viol player's development as a musician, as well as traces of a friendly competition that perhaps complements the polyphonic cooperation of playing consort music. Susanna Perwich, who died in 1661 of fever at the tender age of 24, was the subject of a hagiographic biography by her brother, published as The Virgin's Pattern in the Exemplary Life and Lamented Death of Miss Susanna Perwich. Susanna is described as a multi-instrumentalist, singer, composer, writer, textile artist, gardener, and theologian. Her brother, John Batchelor, lays on the praise really thickly, even for the 17th century, so we should be cautious about taking everything he writes about Susanna without a grain of salt or three. But his descriptions of her music making and composure, as he calls it, offer fascinating glimpses of mid-17th century musical activities, like live performance on lira and division viols and the improvisation of divisions on grounds. Among long passages about Susanna's devoutness, acts of charity, and illness and death from fever are pages of text extolling the fact that she evidently didn't need to practice and didn't make weird faces when she played hard music on the viol, abilities that her brother was seemingly obsessed with and returned to again and again. I'll read a few of my favorite passages. When she was 7 years and a half old, her father removing his dwelling to his school at Hackney, where now he lived. She, among the rest of his children, had the advantage of a choice breeding there, and in short time made no small progress in it, especially in the grounds of music. For at 14 years and a half old, she was able to play in consort at the first sight upon the treble viol, and this with so much skill, ease, and sweetness that she gave no ordinary hopes of proving a very rare musician. Indeed, such an harmonious soul she had, and a genius so exceeding tractable to all sorts of music, that one of her masters, Mr. Ives by name, was wont to say he could play no new lesson before her, but she would have it presently. The first that grounded her in the notes of music and enabled her to play so excellently on the treble viol was Mr. Thomas Flood, who, falling sick and continuing so a long time, occasioned her father to make choice of a new master, Mr. William Gregory by name, who, being eminently skillful at the lira viol, did very much better the making and forming of her hand, and was the first that gave her that sure, delicious stroke, which afterwards became so singularly peculiar to herself. He also taught her all varieties of rare tunings. That which made her so expert, both about her own play and in judging of others when she heard them, was her most curious ear, seldom equaled by any, the very best masters in that art. Diverse books she read of excellent composure, and understood them well, nor cared she for any lessons but what were very choice. But her chief delight was in divisions upon grounds, of which she had the best that England could afford. When she played on the viol, though singly as she used it, it gave the delight of a full consort. But when in consort with other viols, or a set of lutes only, or viols and lutes together, or with the harpsichord or organ, still her instrument was queen of all, and as if it had been touched by more than a mortal hand, gave so delicious a sound, and so distinctly too, that any judicious ear might discern it above the rest. Insomuch that it might be truly said, look what the racy flavor is to the richest wine, fragrancy to flowers, varnish to colors, burnish to gold, sparkling to diamonds, and splendor to the light. That was her ravishing stroke to all the other music. And yet, which was the more admirable, she sat so steady and free from any the least unhandsome motion in her body, so modestly careless, as it were thoughtless of what she was about, as if she had not been concerned at all. And all this she did, though she never spent the 10th part of that time in private practice, which others are wont to do. For indeed, she made better use of her time at other sorts of higher music. Later, Susanna's brother lists how the young viol player distributed her worldly possessions as she lay dying. Interestingly, she gave, quote, all her works and instruments of music to be divided betwixt 3 sisters, which suggests to me that she had grown up playing consort music with her sisters, an image that I love. Finally, I'll impose on you the concluding poem from The Virgin's Pattern, which describes, among other things, an imagined contest in which Susanna vanquishes a pantheon of viol players with her divisions. For the purposes of my talk today, pay attention to how Batchelor relies on framing his sister's musical virtues by locating her within a tight-knit community of viol players. First, for her music, who can give sufficient praise or cause it live, as it deserves in memory, and that to all posterity? Ask Rogers, Byng, Coleman, and others, the most exactly skillful brothers. Ask Brian, Mel, Ives, Gregory's, Howe, Stifkins, all in whom there lies rare arts of music they can tell, how well she sung, how rarely well. She'd played on several instruments, what high admired accomplishments she had attained to. Angel's hands on lute or viol scarce commands a sweeter touch. She never shall be equaled by the nightingale. Laws, Simpson, Polwheel, Jenkins, all, mongst the best masters musical, stand ravished while they hear her play, and with high admiration say, what curious strains, what rare divisions, are we not mong celestial visions? This is no human hand, these strokes, the high immortal spirits provokes to listen to her. She plays so that after her none takes the bow. To play again, it is too much to take the confidence to touch the instrument which she laid down, or go about to win the crown which she had set on her own head, with laurels all enameled. No, no, they must wholly despair to give one such delicious air, of which she millions gave, each touch to most judicious ears was such, so sweet, so quick, so dainty rare, that nothing could therewith compare. No strain but was incomparable, and by men's art insuperable. The deepest grounds where utmost skill of a rich fancy lay, she still most finely nicked her nimble arm, still made a most delicious charm. Quick numerous motions she would show with her swift, gliding, jumping bow. Even in a moment she would measure thousands of strokes with ease and pleasure, where others hundreds scarce could reach, though such as most professed to teach. All this both by her hand and brain, without the least toil, labor, or pain. Susanna evidently had a social network that would be the envy of any viol player, even if they might have rolled their eyes a bit at her brothers bragging on her abilities on the instrument. What's striking to me is how natural it feels to understand a viol player based on her relationships and connections with other players. In order to make Susanna legible to readers, her brother shows us a glimpse of the network of musicians to which she belonged. I'll close with a quote from the antiquarian Anthony Wood, describing the importance of the music meetings in Oxford that occurred during the unrest surrounding the English Civil War and the interregnum, sort of the early part of the second half of the 17th century, the 1650s, 60s, kind of in that era. As in our current moment, people were staying indoors when they could and limiting their gatherings to small groups of people they knew and trusted. Roger North famously wrote that during these years of unrest, it was better to stay, quote, fiddling at home than go abroad and be knocked on the head. Maybe today's version would be better to stay fiddling at home than to go out among the unmasked. Wood writes of his friend William Ellis, who hosted viol consorts for years in Oxford. Quote, after cathedrals and organs were put down in the Grand Rebellion, William Ellis kept up a weekly meeting in his house opposite to that place where the theater was afterwards built. The meeting was much frequented, and many masters of music were there, and such that had betrayed no choirs, being out of all employ, and therefore of meetings, as all other music meetings did flourish, and music, especially vocal, being discontinued by the Presbyterians and Independents because it savored much of Catholicals and episcopacy. It was there more used and flourished. But when King Charles II was restored, and episcopacy and cathedrals with it, then did the meetings decay, especially for this reason, because the masters of music were called away to cathedrals and collegiate choirs. Gathering to play music together even if the circumstances were far from ideal, seems to have been how William Ellis's circle of friends got through a difficult and scary historical period. In this way, they are reminiscent of the Catholic families from the previous century that had relied on the social medium of the Viol consort to covertly capture some of the ritual intimacy that had been stripped away by the Protestant Reformation. The Lestrange family and Susanna Perwich had not needed to hide and were thus able to use the Viol as a powerful catalyst to their extensive social networks, comprised of other amateur musicians and an impressive array of musical luminaries from England and abroad. But crypto-Catholic consort enthusiasts and those that sought refuge from political turmoil in William Ellis's music meeting in Oxford figured out how to leverage the Viol's capacity to bring people together. Even as we mourn the ability to easily gather to play consorts and adapt to NonClave, though, I take some comfort from Anthony's narrative about the Oxford music meetings. The uncertainty and danger of the interregnum ended eventually, and things returned to a new normal, one in which the social networks of musicians and the joyful social medium of consort playing was strengthened for its role in keeping musicians together in difficult times. Thank you.
That was a great lecture, Loren.
Wonderful.
Crypto-Catholic is the new word of the week.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Not at all what I was expecting to hear. Yeah.
It might take a little while for the questions to catch up. The link that we gave originally did not connect. So some people didn't get on when we started. They went to the original link and then they came in late, so they're catching up.
So what should we do about that? Shall we just, chat?
We can chat, but there are questions coming in, and a lot of people have seen the whole thing now. A lot of congratulations here. Hooray. Lovely to see.
I'm gonna refill my sake.
Sounds good.
Cheers, everybody.
Yeah, cheers, Loren. That's great. You'll let us know when we're all on?
So Lisa, do you have any questions there that you are ready to? You need to unmute Lisa. Okay.
I have a question. I love the image of the Catholics circling the wagons with their that vials were used for ritual intimacy. And it's interesting that you said that many of the manuscripts that have ordinary consort music that we know also had untexted mass movements. Have a lot of those mass movements been attributed? Do we know where they're from, or were they just written with, with rhythms that suggest the words of the Catholic liturgy, the Latin words?
There are actually quite a bit more like motets that are untexted, but there are a couple handfuls of mass movements that show up in various places. And I should give a shout out to Zoe Weiss, who I sent a lifeline to a couple days ago to remind me about that. She's in the midst of writing a really exciting dissertation that touches a lot of this stuff, so she's my lifeline at the moment. But the Baldwin commonplace book, for example, has a bunch of Kyries in it that are copied without text, and he says at the beginning of them something like Kyries, and then you look through them, and I'm pretty sure they've all been identified. I think that this was a lot of musicologists were initially excited about this because they were looking for vocal music. And the idea that consort manuscripts, instrumental manuscripts, had preserved some of this vocal music was an exciting discovery. And it turns out there's really a lot of that. consort music, a lot of vocal music that only survives in those sources.
So I'm putting some questions in our chat, and I can read other ones.
Oh, cool. Hang on. Let me arm that. Okay.
You see any of the other part books, and then there's like 4 questions there.
Yeah. I'm not aware of any surviving pieces by Susanna Perwich. And I think that some might be found, possibly though. And I think the move would be this. It would be to look through John Batchelor's book and look at the source. He names a whole bunch of composers whose music does survive, like Ives and Gregory's and a bunch of folks. I think the move would be to start looking at manuscripts that they compiled or that are of their music, and to look through it and start to see if there are some pieces that might be candidates for possibly being transmitted, having been by Susanna Perwich. But I would love that if some of her music came to light. So far as I know, Leonora Duarte is the only female composer of consort music from the 17th century from whom we have actual pieces. So that would be amazing to find some or some divisions, some lyra pieces. Sounds like Susanna sort of did it all. Did I look at these sources in person? Some of them I did. I did dissertation research in England, but we also live in an age now where so much has been digitized, and if it hasn't, you can write to the library and ask them to scan something for you. So it's really changed how research works. I have lots of PDFs on my computer. I pore over them. I get my face real close to the screen. You know.
I wonder, can I ask a quick question? Do we know if it was so interesting to hear that Susanna could play all the different tunings for the Lyra Viol?
Yeah.
I wonder is there any evidence that the Manchester Lyra Viol book might have been hers or compiled in her circle?
Ah, wow. That's a source that I don't know that much about, aside from having played some pieces out of it. I think there's almost no published research on Susanna Perwich. There's one article. And I think these are great questions. I think that like an intrepid person that wanted to try to connect some dots might discover some really interesting connections there. But I love that idea that you know, a big collection of Lyra Viol music might have been in her orbit somehow.
Is there any, did her brother say anything about the names of pieces that she played or the composers that she played, or just he was too busy extolling her virtues?
He was definitely busy extolling her virtue. He does mention a whole bunch of, he does in that passage that I excerpted from about her training, he talks about all of her teachers. And of course we know, Ives has a whole bunch of surviving lyra pieces. I'm trying to remember who else is in there, but there's as I said, I think somebody can dive deeper there and maybe make some connections. Unless of course Batchelor was just kind of making it all up. But I don't think so. I think that there's enough facts in that narrative that it makes it believable to me,
Maybe that's your next project.
Yeah, it could be. So by the way, my website, lorenludwig.com, has some information on Susanna Perwich and a section on women in the history of the viola da gamba with a bibliography. So for those that want some like bibliographic stuff and citations and links to documents and all of that, that's easy to find there. Should I return to the chat here? It looks like questions are accumulating.
Let's see, it looks like someone had a question, whether you had connected any specific music with Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy?
In terms of really specific, so the Anatomy of Melancholy is an amazing, huge tome, which is kind of a collection really of English medical learning up until that period, with a strong emphasis on the humors and on melancholy in particular. It's a wonderful, fascinating, weird book, and easily you can get it, the PDF of it online easily. It's worth a dive if you have 15 minutes or whatever. And yeah, right, 15 years. He, in terms of specific musical connections with the Anatomy of Melancholy, I'm not aware of those, and I haven't seen those in the literature. But there are a number of other. Melancholy was such a thing in England in the early 17th century. It like saturated English culture, so much so that it started to become kind of parodic. Like there's in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, there's this Pyramus and Thisbe episode, this play within a play, and that's a chorister play, and the song they sing would have been a consort song. So Shakespeare actually featured a sort of parody of a melancholic consort song in A Midsummer Night's Dream. So anyway, there was melancholic stuff all over, and there are some musical connections with some of the like medical textbooks, but so far as I know, Robert Burton has sort of frustrated music scholars because he didn't seem to be tracking specific music that much. He has several chapters about music and melancholy, which you'd think would be gold for that, but he was writing in a really like theoretical, kind of abstract, like classical vein, quoting Galen and all this old stuff, and didn't seem that interested in particularly what was happening musically right when he was writing the book.
Did you happen to come across any references to pills to purge melancholy? You know, the Ravens.
I mean, that's in the mix as one of the sources. There's a lot of surviving stuff from the early 17th century on English melancholy, and there's a lot of writing about melancholy, particularly like English scholars have been really interested in it. So it's a sort of dizzying bibliography when you start to fall into it. Someone asks, the treble viol was used by at least one player as her main instrument for lyra viol music. I don't think so. I think that Susanna Perwich played consorts on the treble, and I think she probably played lyra music on a lyra viol, on a sort of small bass viol, is my guess. It would seem a little eccentric. I think that would seem a little eccentric for her to have played lyra music on a treble viol. I'm not sure, but that might have been something that would have been mentioned if she was making that peculiar choice. I'm pretty certain she was playing divisions on a division viol, maybe the same instrument she was using as a lyra instrument. Although the tuning thing is so perplexing, right? That he singles out the fact that she learned all these weird tunings, which makes me curious.
Yeah. I mean, there are Hume uses treble viols, but in some of his ensemble pieces, but not very many.
Yeah, and there are a handful of pieces that use like the wonderful Jenkins lyra suites that use a lyra viol and a lyra viol and a keyboard and a treble viol and a bass viol playing a bass line, or I don't remember exactly what it is, but I wish there was more of that. I wish there was more of that ensemble music with lyra viol. There's actually a great dissertation dedicated to lyra viol in an ensemble context that you can get online, and it's got all the stuff in it. It's a great resource.
Who's the writer of that dissertation? Do you remember?
Oh, you're putting me on the spot. I don't remember.
Okay. All right. Just it's easier with an author. It's easier to look it up. But
Absolutely.
no big deal.
I'm desperately tempted to go into my database here and look it up, but weird tunings on treble. I don't think so. That passage did mention her playing consorts on treble viol, and then I had some other passages that I read adjacent to it, but it appears that I misled people to suggest that her treble viol became the only instrument she played. There are long passages in the Virgin's pattern that talk about her lyra playing. So those were taken from different areas. I just artificially put them together. So apologies for being misleading there. Oh, thank you. John Moran, Stoltzfus, of course.
Oh, yes.
Artzler, thank you. Thank you. Saved me.
I loved your anecdotes. And were they sort of collected into a single volume, or you just sort of find them randomly across the diaries and?
The jests, you mean?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, those are all collected together in one book, and there are more than 600 of them, and they're really fascinating. Back in the before times when Parthenia and Lestrange were going to do our Jenkins project in May, I read the entire jest book cover to cover because I just wanted to immerse myself in Jenkins' world, and they are like delightful and shocking and weird and a lot, and some of them are just I can't understand. I just don't have, like, they talk about, they make in jokes with people that I have no idea what they're talking about. But I would say that 2/3 or 3/4 of them are completely intelligible and hilarious, or weird or shocking, or some, you don't regret reading them. There's they were published they were published as a dissertation, and it's a little hard to get, but it's called Merry Passages and Jeasts. Jeasts is how they spell it in the title of the thing. And you can find, it's like, back in the days when we could go to libraries, I would say you can go to a library and get it. I don't think it's been scanned. But yeah, totally worth, if you're just curious about 17th century English musical culture and consort playing and stuff, there's wonderful, weird stuff in there.
What was the date of that book again?
It's not firmly dated because it's a collection that was accumulated over 20 or 30 years, but it's sort of mid 17th century.
Speaking of spellings, we had a question. How do you spell Susanna Perwich's last name?
Perwich. Nice, easy spelling. And again, I've got a link to some of her materials and to research on her and some stuff like that on my website if people wanted just an easy point of access.
Do we see any other questions there?
Someone asks what happened during the plague, which took place almost contemporaneously with Anthony Wood. Boy, haven't we all been thinking about plague in a new way in this era? My understanding is that there were sort of constantly small outbreaks of plague in different areas. And I want to say that the sort of big outbreak in London took place in 1665. Somebody might want to Google that, and Wikipedia sharpshoot me on that. But they were always navigating plague. I think it's just a fascinating thing that's come to mean something really different to me now. I mean, thinking about like traveling to gather with other musicians, I have all of this empathy now when I read these 17th century sources, particularly about like the Catholic musicians, to just, imagine the conversations we have on the phone with our friends if we're going to go like have a social distanced dinner or something in their backyard, and we like talk it through, we talk about masks and we make a plan, and just that idea that you need to be sort of thinking through all of these really pedestrian things is helping me understand some of these materials that I'm encountering. Oh, thank you, John Moran. Is this chat going out to the? No. Okay.
But I can send that out if that's the right edition.
Man, we've got like a librarian on staff here. This is awesome.
Is that the one? Is that the edition you know?
That's the one. Yeah, that's the only. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great.
It's a paperback of all things. A TypeScript paperback. It really takes you back to the 70s when it was published.
I'll just read it out just so before it gets printed out. But Merry Passages and Jeasts, a manuscript jest book of Sir Nicholas Lestrange, 1603 to 1655, by Nicholas Lestrange and Henry F. Lippincott is the publisher. Salzburg Institut für englische Sprache und Literatur, Salzburg, 1974.
So that's in the YouTube chat now.
Thank you.
It doesn't all fit in one chat, though. It's two chats.
You should try tweeting it,
put the Stoltzfus in there too.
That some of the composers that Bachelor mentioned, like Stifkins and Ives, we don't have a lot of music surviving from them. Brewer, not that much, but
some. I mean, enough. I feel like enough to get a sense. Certainly, in the case of Ives, enough to get a sense of what he was like, maybe.
and I wonder at the end, Bachelor said something about how Susanna was involved in higher music. I suppose that means composing.
I think he meant praying. There's huge. So the Virgin's pattern is long. It's like 150 pages long, and a lot of it is just accounts of Susanna's devoutness and her acts of charity and all of that stuff. So he's like walking this tightrope, I think, of wanting to talk about what an amazing musician she is, but also not wanting that to sound like worldly vanity. So he's countering that with huge amounts of description of her, like, love of God and the higher music of the universe and all of that stuff.
I'm sorry if you answered this before, but is there any portrait of Susanna?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. On my website, I have it, and it's a drawing, but it gives it's a clear likeness. So it's, yeah.
Wow. Well, I guess the looks like the questions might have come to an end, and it's after 9 now, and just want to say thank you so much, Loren. That was really fantastic. Not at all what we expected, but yeah, I hope that you're going to publish this as an article so we can all read it.
Well, thank you so much to the Viola da Gamba Society for hosting me and for you guys putting together such a wonderful event this week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Everybody.
Goodbye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.